Now, most of you have probably gotten well acquainted with Sarah. You've heard messages on her. Maybe you've heard more lessons on Abraham, and Sarah's just sort of, the woman has come along because of her relationship to Abraham. But Sarah is a woman that we're going to learn at least 5 lessons from, and I'd like us to jot those 5 places that we're going in her life down in the margin of our Bible so you'll have them, so that you can think about them and about her testings. Now, I entitled this particular lesson, you'll notice, you don't need to turn to it in your index, but how a good wife will bear up under the testings and trials of married life. Now, that perhaps sounds a little negative, and you think, oh my, is married life made up all of trials and testings? No way. But there are times when decisions have to be made, such as we're going to see in Sarah's life, where it perhaps is very difficult for the woman to agree totally with the decision her husband is making. But as a Christian woman, what does God expect of us? This is what we're going to see in Sarah's life, and that's why I call them testings that are peculiar to the woman, that perhaps wouldn't be quite as difficult for the man as it would be for the woman who likes to have those roots tied right near her home. So beside chapter 11, we're going to back up just a little bit from chapter 12, but beside chapter 11, verse 30, will you jot down Sarah? And why don't you spell her name S-A-R-A-H, even though in the text at this point it's A-I. And we're going to see in our study this morning where God changes her name, and it's changed from an I to an H. All right, box that in with green so that you'll remember everything in the text colored with green will refer to Sarah. That will help you to keep her life separate from that of the maidservant that we studied last week, Hagar. Now, next week, we're going to be studying Lot's wife and daughters, and we'll be using still another color for that particular study. Maybe you don't think there's very much about Lot's wife and daughters, but you look at these chapters that I've given you in Genesis, and you'll find some material that probably will be very helpful to you as a mother and as a wife. All right, then jot down beside chapter 12, verse 1, Roman numeral 1, trial 1. This is the first trial which she had to face. And just 2 words, uprooting home. Uprooting home. And then you can color that in with yellow. Trying to go just a little bit slower this morning, you'll notice, so that you'll all get everything down before we start. Then move over to verse 10 of chapter 12. Verse 10. And beside verse 10, when you jot down, trial 2. And one word, famine. Famine. That's Roman numeral 2, yes. See, I'm giving you the 5 major points. And then I do trust that when you get home and you look at your outlines, that one of the first things you'll do when you review your notes is color in those major points, Roman numerals 1 through 5, on your outline pages with yellow, because that will help you in reviewing the lesson. All right, did you color that in with yellow? And then just move down to verse 13, and we have another testing. It's like a testing right on top of another testing, or what I like to think of it here is as a testing within a testing. And you're probably saying at this point, oh, I know what that's like. You're already in the midst of a testing, and then something else comes along, and you say, God, I've had enough. I can't take any more. Well, probably Sarah felt that same way. So beside verse 13, jot down trial 3. And I'm going to call this, by one word, compromise. And you might want to put in parenthesis under that, half-truths. Those are little gray areas in our lives, half-truths. Color that in with yellow. And then we're going to move on way over to chapter 20, but I had one more point in here before that. I want you to move back to chapter 11, verse 30. You may think we're going backwards, but the reason I'm introducing the fourth point at verse 30 is because of the theme that's given there that we don't discuss until a little later. Beside verse 30 of chapter 11, jot down trial 4 and one word, childlessness, and then put underneath that this reference, 16:1. That's chapter 16, verse 1. Because we're introduced to the fact here that Sarah is barren, but the story doesn't take place until 16:1. And so that's why I wanted you to have it right back here at the beginning. So trial 4, beside verse 30, where you've already jotted down her name. And then your final point is over in chapter 20. And beside verse 1 of chapter 20, jot down trial 5. And I hope we have plenty of time, to get through her life, so that when we get to this fifth trial, you will see the importance of studying this particular trial. It's one that most of us don't like. At least I assume that a lot of you are like me. Have you ever failed a test in school? Now, you don't, that was back far enough, so you don't have to, worry too much about it now. But the things that I always missed on a test when I was in college are the things I remember best today. Because I felt so humiliated to think, how could I ever miss that? However, when we're thinking of God working in our lives, you probably will have to admit, as do I, that I don't learn all the lessons God has to teach me the first time. Some of you are shaking your heads. You're not afraid. You're very honest. And so this is the part we don't like. God says, now, she failed that test. I'm going to give her another make-up opportunity. Now, when you're in school, you're glad if the teacher says a make-up opportunity comes along, because if you didn't, you might fail the whole course. But in the Christian life, when it comes to God's will for our lives, and God says, you failed, and then a few years later he says, I think I'll test that person in that area once again and see what happens this time. And you and I, when we're faced with that same testing that we failed the first time, say, oh no, Lord, not again. Well, let's see how Sarah reacts and how Abraham reacts. Now, you've got that jotted down, have you? No, you didn't. I talked about it. The fifth testing is this. Trial. It's trial 5. Problem repeated. Problem repeated. Now, it's the same one concerning famine. And what are they going to do about it this time? So color that in with yellow, and then go back to chapter 11 and verse 30. Do I have you all back now with me? Chapter 11 and verse 30. I can see a hand down. As I mentioned, speaking of Sarah, we were introduced to the very first time her name is used. In verse 30, it says Sarah was barren, and it's doubly emphasized she had no child. And I have mentioned previously in our lesson with Hagar that to a woman in her day, this was a real blight. It was something that was, the most terrible thing that could happen to her, because every woman wanted to give her husband a son that could carry on the family name, somebody that would receive the family inheritance. And when Sarah found that she could have no children, this must have been a real difficult problem for her to face. Now, in talking about Sarah, we do have to talk a little about Abraham. If I was talking about Abraham, when I teach the men of the Old Testament, I have a 22-point outline on Abraham of how God worked in his life. But we have to see how he, in his experiences, involves his wife in a lot of the decisions which he makes. We're only going to look at 5 areas in her life where she was involved with her husband. But the first time that God deals with the both of them, after we are introduced to the fact that Sarah is a woman who has no children, is when we see them down in the land of Ur of the Chaldees. And if you know anything about the archaeological discoveries that have been made, Ur was a well-developed city. Some of the math problems that they have found from the archaeological discoveries, they have put into the hands of Harvard students to see if they could solve them because they were so difficult. You know, we think today we're living in an age of advanced knowledge, and we sometimes forget that way back here, their minds were made by the same creative hand of God, and we think that they were ignorant people, but they were far from that. And we find here that she lives in an advanced culture. And for 75 years now, Abraham has lived there. He's married. He's settled down. His wife is 10 years younger than he is. She's 65. And we're going to pick that up a little later when we talk about the birth of their child. And God says to Abraham, who at this point is Abram, and his name, of course, was changed later, I want you to uproot. Now, ladies, how many of you have moved from one home to another? All right, a lot of you have faced that challenge. You realize I have in the last few months myself. First time in my married life I've ever had to move. And you know what you accumulate in 27 years, 28 years. Well, here's a man and a woman, 75, 65 years of age. God comes along and he says, I want you to leave your home in Ur of the Chaldees, and I want you to go to a land that I'm going to show you. All right, now, there's a little indefiniteness in that picture. They don't know exactly where God wants them to move. But the first thing God says to them is, are you willing to move if I ask you to? You see how pertinent that is to our own lives. Sometimes God will say to us, it's time for you to move. Now, I know in my own experience, we had built our home in Burlington. We had brought up our family there. We had many memories. And when we first began to suggest to people that we were going to be moving, they said, you will never be happy. You'll always regret it. All of your memories are back here. Well, once in a while, I have to admit that I wonder what the person who's moved into my home has done with it, because I've heard lots of reports. Then I think, well, it's her home now. It's really not mine, so she has the right to do what she wants. But the decision to move is a difficult one. And about 3 years ago, my husband had said to me, well, you know, this house is really far too big for us. We don't need all these rooms. We close off the upstairs every fall, and we really ought to consider moving. And I wasn't too keen about the idea at the time, and at that particular time I was involved in 4 Bible classes, and I was right in the middle of studies in all of them, and I just didn't feel that my work was done there. And yet I said to my husband, well, all right, when he says, let's go out looking. Well, it took us a long time to look to find what we wanted and what the Lord had for us. But last spring, a year ago this spring, we came up to visit this church when Dublin Christian Academy was down here singing in their chorale, and we were very impressed with the work that God was doing here, and we felt that as a result of visiting this church, we would like to move out into this area. So we began to pray very specifically at that time that God would show us if this was His will, and if there were a home in this area where He would have us to move. And when we went to real estate agents for all that summer, nothing showed up that we thought was what God would have us to move into. And then last summer, we found the place we wanted. And at that time, I was more willing to move because I had been bringing my Bible lessons to a climax, knowing that sooner or later the inevitable was going to take place. And like Sarah, I had told my husband, yes, if you feel God wants you to move, I will be willing to move. And yet, way down deep, I wasn't quite all ready to move. You know how it is, ladies, those of you that have had to move. It's a difficult decision to make. And so I had just 2 Bible classes left to finish at that time, and I had so worked it that I had about 10 lessons to finish in each class. And so I finished those lessons. And as I said, we had already put a down payment on a home out here, so we knew we were going to, or at least we were quite assured within our hearts that this was exactly where God wanted us. And we began praying, Lord, work out all the details. Work out all the details. And he did eventually. I won't go into everything that happened, but it took a year for us to get everything tied up and all the loose ends put in place, and finally to move out here to this home that he literally saved just for us. It had to be, because who's going to hold on a home for a whole year in a given locale? It has to be the hand of God just taking care of you in a very special way. So we have no doubt that this is where God wanted us to move. Now, over the winter months, after I had finished my work in those two churches where I was serving at that time, there were ups and downs. Yes, I want to move. I don't really want to. All my family is here. Well, but we've got to now. We've made that decision. And you know how it goes. And so it wasn't until this spring that I was really at the place where wholeheartedly I could say, yes, Lord, I'm ready to go. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what work you have for me out there. I want to be available. But if it's your time, Lord, then we're ready. So I'm just saying that so you can see Sarah, I could always look at and say, she was 65 years old, though, when God called her to move. She'd lived there a long time. And it must have been very difficult for her to leave the cultured city of all of her family, all of her friends, and move out to a country, to a place where she didn't know anything about the civilization or what she was going to face or what the people would be like or any of that. Well, those of you that have had to move know exactly what Sarah went through. You can relate to her in that area. But she went along with her husband, and the thing that I like about in the scriptures is the silences. Now, we don't know why God left silences in scripture, but I like to be positive in my thinking, and I like to feel that it's because she was willing to go along with her husband, and we do read in 1 Peter that she obeyed her husband. That used to be a part of everybody's marital vow, that the woman would obey her husband. That is left out of most ceremonies today. And yet we learn from Sarah that she was willing to do what her husband, as the head of the home, felt God wanted him to do. And there's no place here that she questioned it in any way. Now, if I were teaching Abraham, I would talk about the thing from his perspective, but I just want you to see it from the woman's perspective this morning, how Sarah felt about uprooting and leaving everything behind. To this day, I know women who refuse, now this is Christian ladies too, who refuse to leave their homes even though their husbands have transfers. And there are many miles that have to be covered, work-wise, church-wise, and so forth, because the wife just says, I cannot leave my friends and family behind. Well, ladies, the Lord has made the husband responsible for the home, as the head of the home. And God is going to hold our husbands accountable for how they run our homes and conduct our homes. I've often said I'm awfully glad that God's holding the men responsible, not the wives in a lot of areas, because that kind of, the men's shoulders are broader, and there are problems they can handle in a much more practical way than those of us that are women and have emotions. And we have to remind ourselves once in a while that they are the heads of the homes and that we are the women that God has given as mates and as helpmates, as we learned in the life of Eve. All right, Abraham obeyed. His wife went along with Abraham. They left that home to go to an unknown place. At least we had the security of knowing we had a house to move into. And perhaps some of you have not known where you were going to live when you moved into a new area. But you may say, now I'm in the will of God. Everything's going to go along smoothly. Don't fool yourself. When you start obeying God, oftentimes this is when the adversary begins to work. And it's usually in an area that you least expect him to work. He's subtle. He's wily. You look at Ephesians 6, and it tells us that we have armor to cover our whole body. But there's one part of our body that has no armor. Do you know what it is? The back. Don't turn your back on Satan and let him thrust the dart there. And you have to keep your eyes right upon that enemy all the time, alert to his tactics. alert to his subtle ways. When they got down in the land, and I'm not going to tell you about all the incidents that happened along the way when the father-in-law died and so forth. That's Sarah's father-in-law, but Abraham's father, because we're not talking about Abraham. That was a problem he had to settle with God. But in verse 10, there's a problem that affects the whole household. Now, the husband, this is chapter 12, verse 10, the second point. The husband is responsible for feeding his family, for taking care of his family, for providing for their physical needs. But let me ask you ladies this. When your husband brings home the paycheck and gives you a certain portion, you are the one who's responsible for seeing that that budget stretches to feed your family. All right, now think of all the people that had to be fed in Abraham's camp, because they had many servants. They had many flocks. They had a lot of children probably by the servants. And Sarah and Abraham are, the ones that are over all these people. Number one, Sarah had no other woman on her social level as a result of all this that she could confide in, that she could discuss things with, and she, I'm sure, must have gone through many periods of loneliness. Did you ever stop to think of that in Sarah's life? It's true she had her husband. She was a good helpmeet. They had a real bond together. And she and her husband had real times of fellowship. But don't forget Abraham as the head of all of this vast group of people working under him, because it says that he was very rich in verse 2 of the following chapter, and he was even more rich when he came back from Egypt. He had to be out there supervising a lot, and she was alone. So I think she must have lived rather a lonely life. And this is perhaps one reason why she wanted Hagar to come back with her to be a handmaid, so that she could have a woman around her. All right, now here's a problem. Famine in the land. There is nothing whereby they can feed their flocks. There is no way that they can cultivate the land so that they can raise crops to feed the family. Abraham is doing his best as the head of the home to provide for that family. And he says, I'm in God's will. And I'm sure that he and his wife must have sat down and talked this over together and said, what are we going to do? Now, God told us to leave Ur of the Chaldees. We're here now in the land where God told us we ought to be. But what was their weakness? Now, last week we blamed it all on Sarah, but now we're having Abraham, right along with her, helping God out. He can see no visible solution to his problem, so he says, let's go down to the land of Egypt. All right, his wife had to agree to go down to the land of Egypt. Now, down in the land of Egypt, the land was fertile, it was lush, there was plenty from the Nile River that made the land very fertile, so that they would have plenty to feed their cattle and their flocks, as well as have provision for their own families. And verse 10, I'd like you with your green crayon to color in just 2 words, went down, and underline, to Egypt. Went down into Egypt. That's chapter 12 and verse 10. All right, now God never told them to leave the promised land and go down to Egypt. I don't know if you've ever been in a place where you've had to really trust God in a very special way for the supplying of your needs. When I left home and went to Bible school and college, my folks did not provide for me in any way. They were not Christians. They did not approve of my going into God's work. And so they told me when I left home that they would not ever send me any money to help along the way. And so I had to go by faith and trust that God would meet my needs. And this was a real testing, when I went to Bible school, I wondered where the money was going to come from. I worked for a year before I went, but it was rather difficult to save too much. When I got in Bible school, I went out and worked as well. Today, it amuses me when my children think they can't take time off from their studies to go out and work a little bit to take care of their spending money and so forth. But anyway, the first question that my mother asked me when I graduated from Bible school was this: how much do you owe? Well, do you know, it was a wonder she ever came to my graduation, because my father didn't come and my mother wasn't going to come, but my sister was married to a pastor, and on the way down from Maine, they decided they were going to stop and say to my mother, you know, what are you doing? You really ought to go to see your daughter graduate. And so she was right there on the spot. They got her to come. I think that was a miracle in itself. And that was the first question she asked. You know, that morning I had awakened, and I give this just by way of personal testimony to encourage you if you ever have to trust the Lord. I still owed some on my bill. And I did not want to graduate from Bible school owing anything. And I had prayed all along the way, please, Lord, meet my needs. And the Lord had been faithful over the 3 years I was in Bible school and had met my needs, but that last semester somehow I hadn't quite been able to make it. And I think the Lord is just allowing that testing to go right to the very end. And that morning when I woke up, I still owed some. But I went for my mail before graduation, and I found that my bill had been completely paid. I don't know who to this day who paid it. When my mother came, not too much later after I'd gone to look for my mail, I could just praise the Lord within my heart and say, not a cent. You see, it had to be paid, I believe, for a testimony to my mother as to God's faithfulness in providing for his own, because it was almost as though they were hoping that I would fail along the way, because then where's my great God? And then when I went to Wheaton College, it was the same thing, only, of course, Wheaton was 3 times as much as it was to go to Bible school. But I felt the Lord had seen me through Bible school, and I felt he could see me through Wheaton. And it was just one miracle after another. When I got to Wheaton, the Lord provided. I just can't wait to get to heaven to meet these anonymous people that have so wonderfully provided over the years. And there was one time especially that in connection with this, I thought, there was a famine in the land. Yes, my bills were piling up. It was close to Christmas, my first year as a student at Wheaton. And I didn't go home for Christmas. I felt that I should take on a second job. Now, I was already working in a home, but yet I still owed money, and I knew that I wouldn't get it paid, and I thought God needed my help. So I took on a night job as well as the day job, working in a post office in Chicago. And it only lasted for about 3 or 4 days, and that was just too much for my anatomy. And I really got sick with the flu. And I ended up in the infirmary at school. And this was the first time that my home church came to my rescue. Now, that to me was quite a tragedy. I think home churches ought to stand behind their students when they go out to serve the Lord, when they go to Christian schools. I really feel that way, having been through so much myself. What used to kind of disturb me was that when I went to Bible school, the deacons' children always received automatic gifts from the church. And they gave this reason. Well, they knew the deacons' children were all going to Christian work. But here I was a Christian. I had just gotten saved in my senior year in high school. They didn't know too much about me. They didn't know whether I would really end up to be a Christian that would serve God or whatever, so they never sent me anything. And it wasn't until I was laid out, I couldn't do a thing for myself, that one young man that used to, he was